Hi, everyone. I'm Spencer Pauley here today with the Center Square's Eastern Washington reporter, Tim Klauser, and we're talking about a recent story of his on success no longer being measured by the number of housing units being filled when we're talking about the homelessness issue. And this stems from an interview we had with the HUD regional administrator, Chris Patterson. Now, before we get into it, Tim, your article highlights what I think everyone knows about now, but President Trump's recent executive order criticizing the housing first model and wanting to shift HUD's focus to a treatment first approach. Now, I just want to know what your thoughts are on this, but this is a policy shift that impacts cities like Spokane and over on my side, Seattle, that have relied heavily on the housing first approach. What challenges might they face in adapting to these new federal guidelines?
Well, I mean, there's probably a wealth of them, but the first thing I would say is that if they don't adopt new guidelines, HUD's guidelines for its grant funding, they could face losing that funding, which could upend their system. But I mean, the housing first model is something that's been followed pretty closely since the Obama administration. It came out in the 90s, and then during Obama's tenure, the federal government kind of pushed it more and more. But the treatment first model, which is essentially what Trump's executive order is advocating for, that's nothing new. That was around before the housing first model. And when the housing first model kind of surfaced, it was supposed to be paired with services. It's not just supposed to be, say, you have someone homeless on the street. Okay, well, let's put them in an emergency shelter or an apartment. And then you get them there and then you say, well, if you want to accept services, that would be great. But if you don't, it's ultimately your choice. That's not what it was supposed to be. It was supposed to be paired. There's supposed to be case managers. There's supposed to be people helping get addicts and people that are struggling on the streets into treatment, not just into housing alone. It wasn't supposed to be housing first and only. It's supposed to be a stepping stone. And a lot of jurisdictions, Spokane in some cases as well, have kind of forgotten that core tenet of pairing housing with robust services. And Barry Barfield, the administrator of the Spokane Homeless Coalition, I also spoke to him last week. He told me something similar in that, housing first isn't just putting someone in an apartment. Like I just said, he called that housing only. It needs to be paired with these robust services. And that's essentially what the Trump administration is saying here. They're saying, hey, it's not that you can't be putting people into housing. It's that you need to be focusing on treatment. You need to be getting these people into detox centers, into these rehab centers, so you can help make a meaningful difference in their life, not just so they're overdosing in an apartment. I want to bring up one more point here. The Spokane County Medical Examiner, she recorded a roughly, I think it was 15% increase in fatal drug overdoses from 2023 to 2024. Now, you might think, the vast majority of that increase is probably homeless people living on the streets. And it's hard to say who that group of people is, whether they're homeless or not. But data does show that the vast majority of these overdoses happened inside of a home or some kind of building. So that means that these people were, whether it be emergency shelters, couch surfing at other places, or in transitional housing, there's people in these settings that are just overdosing on their couch or in bed because they're not getting the services that they need.
Right. I think this goes into the most challenging question of all, and what is the root cause? And so I think we all know that the homelessness issue has been dealing with the drug epidemic as well. A lot of people living on the streets suffer from drug addiction, and that's what people are saying is causing them to maybe just be in prolonged homelessness, where they're just stuck in that system where they're just living on the streets. They get into some kind of housing as part of this housing first approach, but then they relapse, just leave, and they just cannot get back on their feet. And I think that's what's interesting is, what is this root cause? And Tim, to me, it's what came first, the chicken or the egg, because are we looking at maybe, things are just become less affordable. People don't make a month's rent and then get evicted, do live on the streets. And then at that point, is there the stress of, that kind of change in your lifestyle that makes you rely on drugs to just kind of ease the pain, and then your life kind of spirals at that point. But there's also the cases where someone does have housing, gets into drugs, and then their life spirals at that point. And it's just so challenging. And, you pointed out that like Barfield says that we need the housing. That's become this housing only approach. And I think a lot of these cities like Spokane, Seattle, when they look at this approach, they do need to include wraparound services, because these people, when they do get into the system, they need to be held accountable. And I think that's one thing we talked about here. So from your perspective, Tim, why has Spokane struggled to just integrate mental health and addiction treatment into its homelessness strategy? Is it just more expensive? Is it way too costly? Because that's what comes to my mind, maybe. But is it just something out?
It kind of depends on where the dollars are flowing. The city is putting out mental health and treatment services as well. It has case management, but the level of those vary depending on where you're at. I mean, the city receives a lot of the more so homelessness housing dollars, whereas the county receives a lot of those treatment dollars. So the county is pushing for more of like these treatment rehab programs. They're building a crisis stabilization center for people like this. So it kind of depends on where you're at. So the city isn't neglecting this entirely. The thing that a lot of people take issue with in the city is the fact that most of these shelters that are funded by the city are low barrier, meaning that they try to reduce any obstacle whatsoever to someone securing housing and maintaining that. And that includes sobriety. So if you're given housing, whether it be an emergency shelter bed for the night or an apartment for 6 months, in most cases, you are not required to stay sober. You're not supposed to have drugs in the facility, but they're not testing you for drugs. Your ability to continue advancing through the system isn't contingent on your sobriety. And I don't want to push this in the sense that, every single homeless person is an addict, because that's not the truth.
It's not the case. Yeah.
Is 50% or so around there. Don't quote me on the number. Yeah, there are a lot of people that are addicts. There's a lot of people who report struggling with mental health issues, but Trump's executive order isn't getting at a sober mom who's homeless with her dog and her 1-year-old living underneath a bridge during the day where you're not seeing them. This executive order is directed at people who are homeless, addicted to drugs, and in most cases refusing treatment. I mean, if you have people that are going through housing and they're happy to go through services, I mean, there would be no problem at all. It's getting to this portion of the population that refuse services. In Washington, Spokane, Seattle, they have a lot of obstacles in this degree, because involuntary detentions are illegal in most situations in Washington. So Barfield suggested, trying to get the state to implement some changes there to kind of open it up, so they could involuntarily commit people into drug rehab. It's hard to say. Barfield's idea that he kind of pushed was, there's layers to this system. Just because there's this executive order doesn't mean that we should maybe do away with low barrier programs altogether. And that opinion is going to vary from person to person. But he suggested maybe, you have emergency shelters, these night by night shelters, the bottom of the pyramid. And he would say those would be low barrier. You don't have to be sober to stay there, but you're going to stay there unless you make some changes. There's different levels to housing. So you might go from there into a different housing project that might not be a night by night shelter. You might be an apartment, some type of transitional housing. But as you advance through the system, he suggested adding layers of accountability, sobriety being one of them. That way, as you progress through the system, you're held to a higher standard, upholding the social rule of law, which is what the Trump administration is pushing for here. That way you're not just saying, hey, there's all these people at the bottom. If they're not going to be sober, they can't even enter an emergency shelter. Cause then you're just going to see a lot more deaths on the street. Even if you did put them in jail, a lot of the times the cost of arresting someone and putting them into jail, housing them there. And in most cases, the Spokane jail is on red light status. So those people are booked and released anyway. So you just be arresting the same people over and over again on basic misdemeanor citations that would just then be camping illegally again. So his idea was having the low barrier shelters at the bottom and moving up from there. But Chris Patterson, the HUD regional administrator, now covering much of the Pacific Northwest, he told me, look, if these municipalities, whether it be Spokane, Seattle, somewhere else, if they're not using all of the tools that they have available, whether it be a camping ban, different types of housing projects, funding these treatment centers, then they risk missing out on HUD funding, which is crucial for these jurisdictions. I mean, I know the city of Spokane, the vast majority of the funding they get to address homelessness comes from the state and federal government, not local tax dollars. I mean, local tax dollars are paying this in the sense that they're flowing through the state and federal government, but it's not the city's sales tax that they authorize. That's so much paying for this. So kind of going on a rant here. But
Tim, I think but what this is all goes, it comes the assumption that more than 50% of homeless individuals have a mental health or drug addiction, I should just say, period, right? And so these, like you said, this executive order targets them. It wants to ensure that federal funding goes towards ensuring that these causes are addressed. Now, but also, I think Patterson said this. It said that, you know, we want to prioritize federal funding for jurisdictions that prohibit urban camping, because nobody wants to walk down a street where you're passing by sketchy tents or just people using on the street. It's unsafe. It's just makes people uncomfortable, and it's just not a great look for the state, the city, the country, right? Now, that just goes along with what Spokane City Council did, which is pass a less strict camping ban. So is it going to be feasible for Spokane to align with these new HUD priorities, especially after just deciding on a less strict camping ban? Or how is that whole situation going to be?
The executive order calls for camping bans, and the city did just pass a citywide camping ban.
Okay.
Was it enough to make a lot of business owners happy? No, not really. There's a lot of provisions in there that allow people to get out of enforcement by moving down the street, agreeing to go to treatment, whether or not they continue to follow up with that. There's the issue that I was asking the HUD regional administrator is that Spokane passed its new citywide camping ban just after the state Supreme Court struck down a voter approved version that prohibited camping within 1,000 feet of a school, park, or daycare, public or private. So it encompassed much of the city. And when the Supreme Court struck it down, it provided an opportunity for the council to reinstate it themselves. And the two conservatives on the council tried to do that twice, but the progressive majority declined. So I said, look, a lot of business owners are upset that the council didn't reinstate the will of the voters and instead went with this more lackluster camping ban. And his response was, look, if they're not using any and all tools necessary to address this, they might lose HUD funding. And that would be detrimental to the city or any jurisdiction really that is receiving those funding for homelessness. His message was, let me just read it for you if I can find it. These are working Americans' taxpayer dollars. They deserve results. They deserve projects, policies that are going to lead to measurable outcomes. And Spokane is trying to improve in this regard by getting more on the providers about inputting data and such. And the city of Spokane likely will shift its how it applies for these grants to align more with the administration's demands. I think that the issues that they might encounter, if any, in the future is the metrics. Are the metrics lining up? And I mean, maybe after time, they look at the metrics and say, this is working or this isn't working. And if it's not working, they change policy and they continue forward. And maybe this executive order will be a success for the city in that regard. But I think it's more unlikely that the city just folds its hands and says, you know what? We don't like Trump. We're not going to change the things, because they can't afford the loss in dollars. If they lose that money, homelessness could skyrocket. And then that's local tax dollars that are filling the gap, that are paying the police overtime, which is already struggling to be on the streets, to patrol these areas. So I think the city, I know you cover Seattle, haven't been as focused on what's going over there, but I think a lot of these cities, whether it be Spokane or elsewhere, they might push back initially and say, whoa, they're trying to further criminalize a vulnerable population. I think they're going to turn around and say, look, we need the money. We'll do what you're saying.
We'll have to see, Tim. And I think we're still kind of in the beginning stages of this, especially over in my area where the King County Regional Homelessness Authority right now is just kind of assessing where they're at. They're talking to the organizations that they fund through HUD dollars. And I guess we'll just have to see where it goes on from here. So with that, Tim, keep out the coverage and we'll have to see what happens. So thanks everyone for watching and see you next week.